All right, thanks. Well, first of all, the organizer for having us and me here, and um, a lot of some of the things have been already mentioned because my presentation focuses on the interaction, and my research focuses on the interaction between decentralization, which is a institutional on one hand process, and the role of patronalism and patronal dynamics, as we discussed already before, in Ukraine. Um, so I guess starting from the general, what is decentralization, right? Decentralization is a process in which, in one way or another, some sort of power is decentralized from the central authorities to regions and, well, subnational units, um, um, broadly defined. Decentralization in general is expected to deliver, increase the quality of governance, increase participation and transparency, social capital and trust, build social capital and trust, and decrease corruption and also the potential for intra-regional conflicts, right? Um, the caveat here is that, unfortunately, is not always the case, right? So, depending very much on the context, decentralization can deliver mixed results and can be affected by or guided by informal networks that we mentioned already today, this morning, can be affected also by a process of informal re-centralization that is driven by the authorities, not only by the because of the mismatch between the allocation of functions and the consequent allocation of or misallocation of resources to local authorities, but also as a political strategy by central authorities. Finally, consolidation, decentralization can also lead to the consolidation of local or regional informal networks or groups or clans, as we mentioned again before. And in the case of a weakly institutionalized party system, it can actually decentralize clientelism and patronage, which obviously negatively correlates with the expectations that I mentioned before. So decentralization in Ukraine actually delivered. There is evidence of enhanced local autonomy and the process of local democratization. Trust and decentralization is helping to build trust in authorities. I guess here the caveat is that trust is in local authorities. So we see the increase of trust through decentralization in local authorities rather than in national government and national authorities. So from the local, we didn't have this spillover effect from the local to the central level of governance. And this is before war. Obviously, in the period of crisis and with the full-scale invasion, decentralization helped to build resilience, or meet the first kind of reaction to the full-scale invasion, and created some these local resources that could be delivered and mobilized rather quickly in February 2022. And we also we have also seen increasing diversity between national and subnational electoral maps, with a lot of diversification at the local level. So what I'm doing actually is trying to build on the last point, the diversification of electoral maps, and looking how decentralization interacts with the context or works in the context of what we call patronalism abroad. I'm not going to discuss in much detail, as we already did discuss this this morning, what kind of patronalism or is. What I guess I would like to mention is that in Ukraine, patronal dynamics have been characterized by, well, first of all, the interaction between formal and informal institutions, in which formal institutions defined in a way rules of the game, while formal institutions played or kind of constructed a general framework to these informal rules of the game. So we have elections, and we have rather competitive elections, despite this being kind of the game being played by different informal actors and networks and by informal rules in many cases. And this resulted in what the scholarship calls regime cycles, right? So the tension of each new presidency to, in a way, centralize power, building his own personal patronal network, and trying to monopolize as much as possible, centralize as much as possible power. And this tension between the different regime cycles resulted in different period of what we call as patronal democracy and patronal autocracy. Patronal autocracy, or attempts to build patronal autocracy, were characterized the periods of Kuchma and Yanukovych, while the more kind of patronal democracy with more pluralism and competition characterized the periods of Yushchenko and Poroshenko. The core point of the attempts or regime cycles, attempts to build a single pyramid regime, monopolizing power, centralizing power, are based on the cooptation or kind of loyalty of regional and local elite networks. And obviously on the presidential power, on the presidential party, sorry, of power. And obviously decentralization in this context is an important game changer, or at the very least, theoretically, it is an important game changer. So decentralization in Ukraine formalized new central regional municipality relations. It increased legally the fiscal autonomy of local communities. It provided, in a way, structural constraints and opportunities to the local elites that, again, even though playing by informal rules in many cases, they needed still to play within a framework of formal institutions. I'm not going to spend much time, I guess, as we don't have much, on the actual process of decentralization that started in 2014. But Ukraine was a relatively centralized country with especially a trickle-down fiscal transfer system in which all the money from the center came first to the region, then to the district, and then to the municipalities. And there were a lot of more than 12,000 municipalities, which were, for obvious reasons, economically and fiscally not self-sufficient. An exception were cities of regional significance, larger cities within the country that were actually able to negotiate directly with the center. So the reform started in 2014, according to two tracks. But the first one, which is required the constitutional amendments to clarify some of the problems in terms of local, regional, and central relations, weren't implemented for obvious reasons, because that would also mean dealing with the Donbass issue and Donetsk and Lugansk after the first kind of Russian invasion in 2014. But the second track, based on ordinary legislation, actually progressed, and we had two stages: the voluntary stage, in which the local communities, the municipalities, were asked to amalgamate and to create as larger units that are were theoretically more self-sufficient economically and as well as politically. And the second stage, 2020 and 2021, actually, yeah, sorry, because I guess my slides, because I see the next slide here. Oh, right. So yeah, anyway, yeah. So stage one, Amalgamated territorial communities were created, so larger units, on a voluntary base. And also experience, and the amalgamation was encouraged by fiscal decentralization, which means that local communities basically received more money. And the results were actually encouraging, but there were also a lot of problems. First of all, not all the voluntary amalgamation resulted or respected the plans that should be approved by regional or were approved by regional authorities. I guess more importantly is that there was an uneven distribution in terms of territorial across Ukrainian regions. So some regions actually amalgamated communities on a voluntary basis faster and better, but with a caveat that in many cases those new communities were still too small. Because if you look at that two graphs, the regions that were faster in amalgamating on a voluntary base were also those with a larger number of new communities that were based on 2 or 3 former municipalities, which means greater, still small. And there were also some interesting regional patterns, I guess, and resistance coming from the center, from the major established and central parties, coming from the regions that were actually in this process losing authority in favor of local municipalities, but also coming from local communities, because the amalgamation process would mean and meant actually that social and public service was also centralized in bigger communities. So villages that before had social services were losing in favor of this, and those were also centralized. So this is just to kind of show some of the results. The second stage was a forced amalgamation, compulsory amalgamation, in which the central authorities decided to redraw a kind of the map in order to deal with some of this problem. But the results again showed that the new units were still relatively small according to what were the plan before, and they preserved some asymmetry across regions as well. And above all, it remains incomplete because the constitutional amendments are still missing, and the duplication of functions creates unstable budget relations between the regions and the local communities, and creates some problems in terms of executive and legislative relations at the local level. I guess, so what I have done in my research is to look at the process of decentralization, some of these problems, and then at 3 local electoral cycles, 2010, 15, and 2020, in order to compare them. Of course, it's a lot of things happen in the meantime, and this is a potential limitation. But what is kind of the perspective of this research on integrating the idea of patronal and informal relations, informal networks in this process of decentralization, is that there is, and there was before war, a clear adaptation of local elites and local networks, which are kind of disconnected from what we know as oligarchs or oligarchic networks at the kind of national level, that adapted to this process of decentralization. So we see that we experience an increasing incumbency rate at the regional level, at the local level, increasing long incumbency, because the decentralization didn't introduce the term limits for local executives, for city mayors, for instance. We also see a sort of presidentialization of local politics, in which the executive dominates the legislative branch and dominates. There is an executive legislative fusion at the local. The head of the municipality is still a member of the council, and the likelihood, at least in 2020 elections, the likelihood of having the same party affiliated with the heads of the municipality party also having the majority in local councils increased compared to previous elections. And in smaller units, there is a stalled competition. So it actually didn't increase a competition or political competition at the village and town level of governance. Despite the good results at the beginning, there is still some problems in terms of economic performance at the local level. As 75% of local communities receive basic subsidies from the central budget, and which is not exactly what was expected. In a sense, this is not a great picture, I guess, right? But looking within the framework of patronal democracy and different networks competing for the presidency in a way, we could potentially argue that this process still weakens the potential for decentralization, right? Oh, sorry, for centralization of power. First of all, the big cities and city mayors emerge as empowered by the process of decentralization. They have more money, they have more power, and they are able to create and consolidate in the longer run their power base at the local level, which in many cases expands at the regional level as well. There are many cases in which the city mayors and the part affiliated to a party control also the same party controls the regional councils as well, extending from the local to the regional level. As I mentioned before, increasing electoral margins, but I guess the most important part is the proliferation of regional parties that are used as political vehicles by city mayors to, again, consolidate and integrate the power beyond the city, beyond the municipality, but extend it at the regional level. So this creates, in a way, an asymmetric situation with the emergence and the consolidation of different regional regimes, some of which are more open, and some of which, on the other hand, are more closely associated with patronal dynamics and patronal autocracies in some cases. This obviously also emerges from a situation in which one of the pillars of patronalism is missing, which is the consolidated and vertically integrated party of power. The servants of people, despite the great performance in the parliamentary elections after the victory of Zelensky, didn't perform well at all in the local elections in 2020. Well, this is just a list of some of the major local or regional-based parties that comparing to 2015 elections and 2020 local elections. You see that the number and the performance of these parties actually increased. So what are kind of the general conclusions before war is that, well, we experienced the autonomization, I guess, of regional networks. So increasing diversification, and they are increasingly autonomous from the broader network in the center. Fragmentation and localization of the party system is another issue, and increasing influence of mayors and their networks. So as I said, on the one hand, the risk is the consolidation of centralized regional regimes, but on the other hand, and here I guess is the opportunity in a way, is a decreasing chance of the centralization of power and sliding into patronal authoritarian regime. So breaking these regime cycles, that will probably open a room for, in the future, may open a room for non-patronal dynamics. I briefly read in 2 minutes, I guess, what about the consequences of war on this? The paper doesn't, I don't have primary data on this, but some of the what kind of tendencies are already rather clear. Of course, war brought consolidation of the executive vertical, a sort of re-centralization of power, a weakening of regional political vehicles or machines of regional parties because of, well, politics have been suspended, and the decreasing economic resources because of the war, because of the damages at the regional and local level. I'm not gonna dig too much into regional disparities. I've already kind of mentioned some of these things, and maybe we can discuss it later. Another two core points is the introduction of regional military administrations during war. So the recreation of a decision-making vertical and the recreation also fiscal vertical. That is an important element because despite formally the local authorities remained in power in many cases and with the same functions, there is an informal influence, increasing formal influence of regional authorities. And let's remember that regional authorities are appointed by the president and not elected. There's increasing influence on budget decisions as well. So re-centralization also of financial resources with the military PIT that has been re-centralized and controlled by the central authorities. And we experience this looking at kind of what's happening, the increasing tension between central and local and civil and military authorities is clear with, well, Klitschko, I guess, is the last examples, but there were many examples of local authorities criticizing the central. So I guess the risks, and I finish here, are several, right? In a way, the ambiguous legal and informal role of regional military administration, lack of clarity in the process of local military administration is introduction, and again, the general weakening of subnational political leadership that actually experienced before war an increase in terms of power and control on their localities and regions. But to kind of end with some optimism, the presidential authority didn't actually create its own oligarchy group, which is kind of and one of the elements that may break this regime cycles in Ukraine. There is not a consolidation. There wasn't a consolidation of the party of power because, despite the kind of dominance within the parliament, servants of the people is still well, it has issues and internal division, fractions, and it needed to rely actually on other parties to put their legislation during the war. There is not a stable cooptation of subnational networks. It's temporary, but not through the party of power. And finally, of course, all these arrangements are due to war. So hopefully they are temporary. And a final note, I guess, on the importance of civic activism at the regional level that was important before war, is important during war, and may be very important after.